All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you this morning on mold in Oregon and real estate transactions. This is an accredited class, so as was noted on the first slide, please provide your information over so that a certificate can be given to you. This class is well, I want to say it's a little bit open dialogue. We understand that you're going to have questions. That's probably why you're here. So, in light of that, we'd love for you to ask questions as we go through the class and get those answered as much as possible, so that your answers are being given in a timely fashion. Even if it's something that we're going to cover later, we'd rather you ask those questions, have that dialogue back and forth, so that this is important and valuable time for you. So without further ado, let's get going with our presentation. Just a little bit about me. I serve as Alpha's Salem branch manager, among other positions, and I've worked in the environmental industry for about 18 years. This included several different types of projects, and that serves in some way to illustrate a background of our company. We provide mold remediation as well as several other services. And so hopefully you'll get a little bit of a picture of that and a hopefully refreshing approach as we go through the class here. The topic of mold is certainly interesting. I'm sure you've dealt with unique situations over the years in your real estate transactions. So we'll hopefully touch on mold in a helpful way in this class. Some basic learning objectives. We'd like to present what mold is, at least as far as a basic understanding, how mold can affect you and your clients, a review of standards of practicing for investigation, testing, and remediation. We'd also like to share on mold regulations and treatment, and then also how mold can affect real estate property transactions. So first, and a logical question, what is mold? Well, mold is a naturally occurring, a biological or an organic, and essential to life aspect. So if you read this initially, you might suggest that those are positive words. Naturally occurring, biological, organic. If we saw that on a carton of milk, we'd probably be more inclined to put it in our grocery cart. And that's really a part of our approach with mold. We'll get to certainly the health effects and the consequences in some cases of mold, but it is worth noting that mold is actually essential to life. If you're somebody that enjoys wine or cheese, certainly common around this area, Pacific Northwest, you are experiencing a byproduct of mold and related products. So from that perspective, mold should be considered as something that it actually has its benefits. Certainly not beneficial when it's in your house in a direct breathable space, but there are cases where it is in fact helpful. Mold is cyclical. Mold colonies produce spores, and those spores produce mold colonies. So basically, if you have mold growth that has started, it can cause and will continue to cause, in some cases, additional growth areas. Once mold spores are in the air, they are either viable, they're capable of growth, or they're non-viable. Spores settle and feed onto the surfaces itself, or on the organic matter in the surrounding dust or grease or scum, etc. Mold spores and MVOCs. Outdoor mold spores vary greatly with geographical location, seasons, and weather. We experience a real shift in the Pacific Northwest that is not common throughout the rest of the country. In Oregon, mold is, I believe, the second highest concentration as compared to the rest of the 50 states. If you go to somewhere like Arizona, the mold in the air is almost non-existent. And that's something that's worth noting. We do experience mold in air. You are most likely breathing at least some trace levels of mold in the air right now, whether you're in your house, your office, your car, or unless you're in a clean room environment, you most likely are breathing in some amount of mold spores. That being said, mold growth is found less frequently in drafty houses than airtight ones. We also find that new construction can actually inhibit proper air circulation. So We'll get to this as well in terms of why mold growth occurs. But new construction can sometimes be a issue with mold growth occurring. Now, mold produces a gas that's called microbial volatile organic compounds, or MVOCs. And MVOCs are produced by mold in houses in very, very low concentrations. But in some cases where there's an odor that's occurring in a house, that's where there's a musky presence. Or in some cases, we've certainly heard and talked to people that say, hey, when I walk into this house, I know I'm smelling mold. And that's very possible. And what they're actually smelling is these MVOCs. It's the off-gassing of the mold colonies that are present. Now, it doesn't necessarily tell us how much mold, where it's located, and if it's a major issue, if there is an actual odor. But it is something that's helpful as part of this investigative process. In the bottom right, we have a diagram of a house where we're looking at air going in and out of a house. This is sometimes helpful in our investigative processes because a lot of times we get questions about how are we going to investigate for mold and why we are doing the testing that we're doing when we make a recommendation. We'll get to the process of air testing, but we will always take an outdoor sample for background comparison as well as an indoor sample when we're testing mold spore presence in a house. So this ventilation intake and exhaust process is something that's helpful for us to know and may be helpful for you all to consider as we're looking at mold within a house. As far as mold requirements in order to grow, it needs basically four different things. It needs food, it needs oxygen, it needs a certain temperature range, and it needs water. Now, food is something that is essentially readily accessible in most air. Oxygen, too, is something that's generally readily accessible in air. That's what we breathe. Temperature range, this is why in a lot of cases we see more mold up in places like attics than, say, crawl spaces where the temperature is lower. It's not to say that mold cannot grow in crawl spaces. We certainly see it there, but it needs a certain temperature range in order to be most likely to grow. And that ideal temperature range is usually between about 65 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So indoor airspace is ideal for that. Attic space, unless it's the middle of the summer, generally ideal for that. Now, water is really one of the big keys as well. When we're talking about water, we're not necessarily meaning just water in terms of a spill or accumulation, but water actually in the air. And this is why, in part, we look at relative humidity. As it notes on the next bullet point here, mold generally can grow only if the moisture content of the building materials exceeds about 18%, or the relative humidity of the air exceeds about 65%. Well, for those of you that are weather experts or understand how the weather works, we deal with a lot of high humidity here in Oregon. This is a major reason why in Oregon we have so much mold growth. So the only practical way to stop mold from actually growing is to prevent the water intrusion or to control the humidity, and sometimes both. This diagram is hopefully helpful because now that we've considered that mold grows as a result of water or moisture buildup, it makes sense where we see mold growing. We see it growing first around areas like windows and doors, especially older windows and doors where perhaps the molding around the windows has deteriorated over time, and now water and condensation buildup from the outside is present and is now resulting in mold growth. There are cases where if you have a chimney or flue, there can be buildup from that. There can be higher moisture from certainly like fireplaces. Bathrooms is probably the number one culprit of mold growth in all houses, either from actual buildup in the bedroom itself, or excuse me, the bathroom itself, or in the attic space, generally directly above those, where the fans are exhausting the vapors from shower use, from general bathroom use, out into the atmosphere. There are cases, obviously, where there's plumbing leaks, small or large, and so we generally look around areas like sinks to see if there is any obvious plumbing issue that could be resulting of mold growth. There are also cases where inadequate kitchen ventilation can be a culprit. We've dealt with situations where someone really likes cooking, and when they like doing their cooking, they may not prefer to ventilate as well as they could or should. They don't have a window open. They don't have a ceiling fan going to disperse those now moist vapors that have the potential, at least, for mold growth. There's also moisture transfer through cement floors and walls in a basement. That's in part why sometimes we see mold growth in a basement, not always. Roofing problems, that seems like an obvious one. You're letting the stormy weather that we love to experience here in the Pacific Northwest into the house. And so those roofing problems can result in moisture buildup and then mold. Now, this is somewhat a surprising slide for in some classes because mold guidelines is what we have written, and that's because there are no federal, state, or local regulatory statutes or requirements for mold inspection or remediation. That might seem very surprising because when we talk about things like sewer scoping, there is at least plumbing code, and there's a typical industry standard for what a sewer scope is passing or failing. If we're dealing with underground storage tanks, if the tank is tested and found to have leaked, there is a exact standard for what is considered passing or leaking. Things like asbestos have, again, a definite passing or non-passing level of asbestos-containing material. Mold is completely different in that way. And there's actually a lot of mold-related organizations that exist, and they all claim to have the best information. This can make this very difficult when we're talking about how do we investigate for mold and how do we set up remediation requirements. We find that organizations do not always agree on inspection or remediation methods, and in some cases, even the health effects of particular types of mold. And many of these organizations have developed their own and sometimes conflicting guidelines. So this obviously presents a difficult situation when you're working with a buyer and trying to find out what can we ask for in the real estate transaction? What credentials or what guidelines or ideally regulations can we point to when we say, hey, this mold that's growing in the attic, that's growing underneath the sink needs to be addressed. So what guidelines should be used? Now, this slide we're going to go through rather quickly. I'm not going to read through all of these. I simply have them up as a way of showing some of the organizations that are out there. And quite frankly, most of these are, I would say, have good science as a basis for their industry and organization. And in some cases, we may even reference them. Should be noted that mold professionals are usually accredited from one of these mold organizations, but are not always licensed in every single state. Some of these entities are founded in the northeast region of our country or southeast region of our country, where the mold and mold conditions are very different. The mold guidelines that most organizations and that we've seen locally use follow one of these three major organizations. ANSI, that's the IICRC standard. This is the standard that's used for most remediation companies. So when we're talking about water damage in particular, if you have an insurance claim, this is the standard that's used 100% of the time. And it is very strict and rigid. And it's in that way in most cases because of the insurance requirements that are associated with those projects. Usually when there's water damage, especially from a plumbing source or a roof leak, if there is an insurance claim, they want to follow rigid standards so the mold does not come back, that it doesn't have any health risk. And so because of that, this rigid standard, the IICRC S520, is generally referred to. There are companies that follow this in all of their mold remediation. There are other companies that may not. There's the guidelines of assessment and remediation of fungi in indoor environments. This is actually a fairly good one. And mold remediation in schools and commercial buildings from the EPA. Now, for mold guidelines, generally agreed upon, mold guidelines usually include the best way to remediate is to physically remove it if practical. Now, there's cases where mold growth has occurred on sheeting, especially framing or the underside of roofing, and so physical removal may not always be practical. The only way to prevent mold growth is to fix or eliminate the sources, as we've been talking about. The leaking pipes or roofs, condensation, and relative humidity, keeping that below 65%. Looks like we have a question this morning. Will we have access to these slides? Yes, absolutely. We will have access to those slides. I am happy to provide basically a PDF copy of all these slides after the presentation. That's pretty standard for us. And so we can provide that when this is done for you all to have as reference. Thank you for the question. General cleanliness will go a long way to preventing mold growth in normal houses. This is a really important point that we like to note, especially it's not as much of an issue in, say, real estate transactions, but there are cases where there are properties, as you know, that are sold with tenant occupancy. And that tenant occupancy can sometimes have additional issues, say mold, for example. And we find, especially when we're working on properties with occupancy, and especially in cases where we're working on multifamily buildings, if there is a general lack of cleanliness, to put it as nicely as possible, that in many cases will result in mold growth. For example, if there is dirty laundry that sits in a corner of a room, especially if it's dirty gym clothes that might have a little bit of moisture accumulation, I don't want to say it's 100% of the time, but it's probably high 90s that will eventually result in mold growth if it's left there, especially for a couple of weeks. It's just inevitable. If we go back to the things that mold needs to grow, you can check all the boxes. It's going to have oxygen, it's going to have food, it's going to have moisture, and it's going to have that ideal temperature range. So moldy gym clothes are very common and they can certainly cause issues in a case where there isn't general cleanliness. Another common issue that we see is actually just that, the mold that exists in bathrooms and around windowsills. In some cases, that is there because of actual building issues. The window frames have deteriorated, they're allowing moisture to go in. And so it's possible that mold growth can occur, and there's not actually a major issue other than the windows are simply old. And so addressing that in a simple way of cleaning can go a long way to preventing a major mold growth issue from occurring. It's really important to note that mold mostly affects people with compromised immune systems. This is not to say that mold doesn't pose any health risk at all. There are certainly cases where mold has caused people to be ill, maybe even ill to the point of hospitalization. But it's worth noting this because some people can experience mold without any issues. The example I like to give is three people at our company. We have one individual, if he walks into an attic without any respiration control, and there's mold up in that attic, he's down for the day. He literally will have to go home and he will be bedridden because of breathing those mold spores. He is somewhat immune compromised. He was in the military for a while. He experienced some conditions that resulted in him having his immune system. Someone like me, I've been around the mold industry for a while. If I go up in an attic without any respiration control and I'm doing an inspection, let's say it's a brand new house, I'm not expecting any mold, and so I don't have that breathing protection, and there is some mold up there. I don't usually notice it for about 10 minutes. And then I start to get sniffles. And that's usually a good tell for me to know whether there's mold or not. And it doesn't have to be a lot of mold, just enough where my body notices it. I'm not sick, but I certainly notice the mold. And then we have other people in our business. Usually they're people that have not been exposed to mold for prolonged periods of time. And because of that, they can go up into an attic without any respiration control and maybe even work all day. It's amazing to see. I may have been like that earlier on in my life, but there are very literally three different types of people when it comes to mold and mold exposure. I see noting here that if there's a question, yes, please submit it into the Q&A. I will answer these as I see them. I have this pulled up here so we can definitely get any questions answered as we go through the class here. It's worth noting that people with allergies may be allergic to specific types of mold. We sometimes hear someone call into our office and say, hey, my doctor is giving me a diagnosis that I'm allergic to this particular type of mold. Very possible, not at all unusual or unrealistic. And so it's worth noting that some people are allergic to specific types of mold. Got a question here from Susie. What is the best way or best product to clean mold infested areas in a typical house? Great question. So there are a number of things that can be used. The one thing I usually recommend is most people are in an area with a local hardware store or a store like Fred Meyer. It's going to have a little bit better variety than a standard, grocery store. I would go to that store, I'd look through their cleaning products, and I'd find one that has a antimicrobial or a fungus-based killer as part of that package of what it's supposed to clean, and it's best ideally suited for. So I would use one of those products that specifically antimicrobial is kind of the vernacular to be looking for. There are people that say, hey, I'm just going to use some bleach. Technically, you can use bleach, but technically, you can also use water and remove the mold depending on what the surface is and doesn't necessarily treat the underlying issue. So, that is where we recommend an antimicrobial. That is what we use for all of our mold treatment, whether it's a restoration project or a real estate transaction. Every single situation has an antimicrobial to not only remove any three-dimensional growth if possible, but to treat those areas as well. So hopefully that answers the question, Susie. We don't have a product that we necessarily say this product should be used because there are a number of good products out there. And depending on where you're at, the store you are closest to may not have that product. So store like Home Depot, Fred Meyer, any general hardware store might be a good idea. Follow-up question there. When you clean the mold, does it release mycotoxins? Do I need to be suited up for general cleaning? That's a really good question. Depending on where it is and your particular health level, I would recommend not necessarily being suited up for it, but certainly some respiratory control, even a mask, a normal mask that we've been using since COVID. It is a great idea just so you don't breathe any of the mycotoxins that are potentially released or even the chemicals themselves. They're not always ideal to breathe in directly. So, in my opinion, there isn't anything you should do 100% of the time, but it's worth considering to wear some basic respiratory questions. Yeah, Susie, the N95, that's a great place to start. If you want to go above and beyond, I don't think it's a bad idea to purchase an actual half face air respirator with filters, with cartridges. Places like Home Depot and Fred Meyer will have those, and that will filter out the toxins a little bit better. Ideally, you would be wearing a respirator that has organic filters on it, and so the N95 doesn't technically have that. It will trap a lot of the spores from entering into your breathing system, but it's certainly better than nothing. Wearing something like a full Tyvek suit, I would say that's probably more than what's needed unless you are actually doing some treatment in your attic and the whole attic is mold infested. If you're doing a project like that where, I mean, maybe a good way to think about it is if you're spending more than 5 to 10 minutes to clean it, you should probably go the next level up with protection of yourself with a Tyvek suit. And yes, Susie, you can certainly contact me after the class. I'll have a phone number on the last slide. And I'll give you my cell here as well. All right. So people with allergies can be allergic to specific types of mold, and the ingestion of significant quantities of moldy food can be an issue. Now, usually this is not an issue. In most cases, most people have to ingest a significant quantity, as it says, for it to really be an issue. Breathing is what we're generally talking about when we're talking about mold exposure. Health effects, in almost all situations, mold at worst irritates the respiratory system, nose, throat, eyes, etc. It can aggravate existing allergies, cause skin irritation, and may make one sick if ingested. Again, it's not to say that there maybe are not worse issues with long-term exposure, but usually that's what we're talking about is someone that's living in a house with mold for a long period of time when they're having maybe major issues like mold toxicity poisoning, which is a real thing. And I know a few individuals that have had it, but that it was a long-term exposure. And in each case, it was someone that already had a compromised immune system. Most people, like me as an example, might just get a stuffy nose. There are people we've talked to that, yeah, they have skin irritation, they have difficulties breathing, minor or major, but in most cases, a lot of people don't have any potential change from being exposed to mold. There are also cases where allergies might develop from a long-term exposure, but this actually has not been conclusively established as a scientific study. Most people have immune systems that kill inhaled mold spores and remove them from the body. And going back to the MVOCs that produce the musky odor that we know, the MVOCs from the mold colonies that are found in typical houses produce no health effects that have been documented scientifically. And again, this is a scientific perspective. You're probably going to hear somebody or know somebody, or maybe you are somebody that says, I know when I smell mold, the next thing that's going to happen is about 5 minutes later, I'm going to have problems breathing and I'm going to have my skin break out. It's not to say that that's not happening. We wouldn't ever say something like that. But from a scientific perspective, those studies have been difficult to prove up to this point. And the OC effects can be psychological, smelling mold and therefore assuming it's causing harm. This is a really interesting thing. We've talked to several people that say that when they smell mold, they begin to have psychological, or they might have issues that we suspect are psychological. It's not to say that it's 100% of the time. Again, there's mold toxicity poisoning. There are people that have legitimate allergies, but in some cases, just looking at the conditions of a property, and especially after we've done an investigation and testing to prove that there's no mold in the house, it's very possible that the MVOC effects and mold effects that they might appear to be having are psychological. The actual amount and frequency of exposure plus an individual's immune system really determines the potential health effects. Again, me, probably when I started in the industry, I could have been around mold for hours and it would have been fine. Now, 18 years in, if I go up in an attic, as I mentioned, there are some health effects that I notice. This is a really important slide. Black or toxic mold. It's probably the slide you've all been waiting for. Black and toxic mold are actually misleading terms. There is not a proven direct correlation between mold and disease in individuals with healthy immune system. Now you might say, well, I've seen media articles about black mold or toxic mold. I might have read one. I remember reading an article from several years ago down in Silverton. The school that was down there mentioned black mold and toxic mold, I believe, as reasons for their discontinuing of that school's use. Now, there were also other factors in that school, asbestos and lead. So sometimes black and toxic mold, those terminologies, are present in an article, or certainly the media has used them. But again, it's not because there's necessarily a science basis. In fact, these terms originate back from the 1990s. There was an article that was published that linked a particular type of mold to the deaths of 13 infants from acute issues in an Ohio hospital. You might say, okay, well, that makes sense. I know mold to be an issue. Well, some further investigation from this article revealed that infants that lived in those conditions were, in fact, living in damp, dirty, dusty, and run-down government housing with cigarette smoke and alcohol. And in fact, the further investigation that was done into this article, it got to a point where the entire article was later retracted after the evidence was disproved, which might make sense. If you're considering a house with a number of different issues, it's dirty, it's dusty, cigarette smoke, those are all potential factors that can cause health issues. Those are all more scientifically documented, I would say, than just the presence of mold in a house. It's also worth noting that infants, in a lot of cases, already do have a compromised immune system. That was likely a part of what they were dealing with there. So when we talk about indoor contaminants, mold of which being one of, we talk about it in a little bit of a more broad approach. Mostly because when we get phone calls, sometimes it's, I don't know what is in my house that's causing me sick, but there's got to be something in here that's causing it. So when we look at indoor air and indoor air contaminants, we are actually looking at several other things besides mold and including mold. We look at things like chemical off-gassing from building materials and household products. These can include things like volatile organic compounds or formaldehyde. Excuse me. We look at things like smoke, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. We look at things like ozone and radon. These all have different health effects, some of which have been very well proven, others that are still in process. But of those lists, basically everything on there has been documented and proven to have health issues. Not to say mold doesn't, but these have been more scientifically proven to cause issues. Indoor air can contain many natural contaminants, including mold spores, pollen, plant particles, skin cells, hair fibers, soot, cellulose fibers, starch particles, asbestos, dust, Legionella, viruses, insect parks, dust mites, rhododendron. No, a really, really gross list of things. But it's helpful to know that because when we're talking about someone that goes into a house and they're immediately seeing issues with their health, it might not be mold. Certainly could be, but there are other factors that should be considered so that you don't narrow in on one when there could be other things at play. Question here, are there specific attorneys or actions that can be taken by a tenant where black mold is present, but a landlord will not do anything? Any recommendations for websites or other support? Um, that is a good and a tough question. From what I've seen, there are very few situations where a tenant can do anything against their landlord and or even a landlord against their tenant as a result of mold. I know back in the day when I had a rental agreement, there were papers regarding mold and notifying of mold growth and not treating it myself. But as far as I know, there are not actual mold regulations that say I am living in a house with mold, so now I'm going to sue my landlord. There are cases where I think that has been done, but I haven't heard of many or really any that come to mind that were successful. In terms of recommendations for websites or other support, I would recommend talking to an attorney if there's a situation where that's coming up. Probably a attorney that specifically deals with tenants or property disputes is probably a good place to start. We don't have an attorney that we recommend in particular, just because of how difficult this is for really anyone to investigate and to go through. So unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do to help with that. In most cases, I recommend if I'm talking to a tenant that they move out. That's honestly going to probably be the easiest thing, as difficult as it may be, to move all their belongings and their life out of wherever they're living. That usually is easier than any legal action and certainly the prolonged process of going back and forth. We do get involved in many of those types of disputes and situations, and often there's very little that can be done because, as I mentioned, if mold is growing, how do we know that it's not a result of the tenant and their living style? Are they someone that maintains their apartment very well? If they do maintain it very well, how do we know that they're using all the tools at their disposal? For example, if there's mold growth in a bathroom, are they using the fan that is in there to make sure that those moisture levels that build up from just the shower use, they're being dissipated properly into the attic? So I apologize, we can't offer a little bit more there. Those are difficult situations. And if there are Specific cases, I'm certainly happy to talk to you about it separately after this. Interesting to understand that a way a tenant is living can impact mold growth too. Yes. And honestly, when we're talking to a property owner, that's usually one of the first things we notice. Hey, the tenant might be causing the mold growth. And it'll be interesting because, yeah, they'll say, hey, the tenant's calling me and saying there's mold in my apartment. And we go in there and there's just piles of trash everywhere, gym clothes, everything else. And we've seen it several times. Yes, the way a tenant is living can definitely impact mold growth. All right, we got quite a few slides here, so I'm going to try to burn through a little bit more quickly. Indoor contaminants, sick building syndrome causes building occupants to feel sick without any specific identifiable causes, including mold spores. We've talked about this a little bit, but there is that terminology, sick building syndrome. Legitimate thing. People do have different effects when they go into a building. However, in many cases, as was mentioned, it can be psychological. Not 100% of the time, but some of the time. So now we've looked at mold. We've established that mold is actually something that's important for life. It's present everywhere. There are conditions, unfortunately, very common in the Pacific Northwest that result in mold growth. So how do we go about going into a house and seeing if there's mold present? Believe it or not, a visual inspection is the most common, and it's really one of the best. There are rare cases where mold actually doesn't build up as much behind walls or in little nooks and crannies because moisture is most of the time not getting in those places. So visual inspections are very common. In addition to visual inspections, what has happened over the last several years is the use of a thermal camera because that will identify cooler areas that might identify areas where the air is moist or have dampness. And damp areas, because there's moisture, are more prone to mold growth. So most cases, if you're getting a mold inspection from Alpha or from another company, highly recommend talking to a company and making sure they have a thermal camera. It is a very useful tool as part of this inspection process. There are cases where we'll do an inspection of a property and testing is now being recommended or asked in most cases as a next step. If we do an inspection of a property, we very rarely recommend testing afterwards. Why? Well, if mold has not been identified visually or with an infrared camera, it's very possible that there is not actually any mold throughout the property. Do we guarantee that? No. There isn't a company out there that's going to guarantee there's no mold because of how easy it is to grow and how many nooks and crannies there are in every single house. Well, what happens if mold is identified? Then logically, we should test, right? No, if mold is present visually, it probably is mold. There are things that we look at that we know right away if they are or aren't mold. We probably won't get to the slides, but you guys will get the slideshow afterwards. We have several examples of things that are mold and things that are not mold at the end of the class that hopefully will help as part of this process. Testing of the airborne and mold spores is the most common way to go about this. This may help determine if hidden mold is present, but it does not show the location because it's just testing the general air. It's not really possible to identify or to isolate an area of mold in a house to determine where that mold's coming from, which is part why we recommend the inspection up front. Hidden mold can be found in wall cavities, dust, food, in or under carpet. We generally will find these with a visual inspection. The wall cavities is the one where we may not, but that's why we use an infrared camera. So if there is mold back there, we will most likely see it as a temperature difference with the rest of the house. Best way to locate is to examine areas of water intrusion. I manage our restoration department. That's really the first thing we look for. What is the moisture source? Why is there mold growth present? We also don't necessarily differentiate between viable, living, and non-viable dead spores because those actually affect people in the same way. If you're allergic to mold, it doesn't really matter whether it's growing mold or not growing mold. So sometimes we get those questions, well, are you testing for the living mold or the non-living mold? We're testing for both. And it really doesn't make that much of a difference whether there's non-viable or viable mold because we're still going to look for the source. And once the source is addressed, it doesn't matter if that's living mold or not. Now, we find that inside levels exceed outside levels without mold growth in the property. That might seem surprising. Well, as I already mentioned, there's mold present in all air. So what can happen is mold growth that occurs outside, especially in rainy conditions during the spring that's shortly coming up, can wash out the mold spores outside and cause the indoor levels to appear artificially high because they're trapped. They're going to eventually dissipate out, but at the short term, they're trapped. Outdoor levels change throughout the day or season and are not always in phase with the indoor levels. Generally, the indoor level of any type of mold should not exceed 10 times the outdoor level of that same type. So that's where when we do a test for air and the levels are higher inside than outside, it's actually not at all uncommon. I would say it's more common to see that. But unless it's 10 times the outdoor level, we don't consider it to be an issue. That's generally an industry standard from other companies I've talked to. This is one example of a chart that you might see for mold testing. Without getting into the numbers too much, the total spore count is generally the most important number. That's the bottom number that has all caps, bolded letters, spore count. So in this case, the inside level is 3,400 and the outside levels are 890. This was a house with no visible mold growth, didn't find anything. You might say, well, how could it be that much higher? Again, we're in the Pacific Northwest where mold is present in all air, and sometimes general house breathability doesn't allow for it all to be dissipated. There are other cases where we test the surface with a tape sample. Again, very rare. In most cases, we visually identify mold from experience and from our training, and we say, yes, that is in fact mold. This is why you have home inspectors in many cases that they say there is microbial growth or fungal growth and a report in the attic. And they are right 99% of the time. And they also, just like you all, get training as part of their work. So if we see a report that says fungal growth, we're going to assume it's mold growth. There have been cases we've been wrong. I don't remember the last one. Generally not necessary, as I mentioned. A sample of mold might be needed in some cases with insurance or in some cases to prove without any measure of doubt that there is a surface with mold. Some cases, surface samples might be used to demonstrate remediation. All right, now we're in the treatment process. Harped on this quite a bit during the class. I know we've done that a lot, but first we really want to identify the moisture intrusion issues. Humid issues should be dehumidified. So this is a good point to talk about what happens when we find mold, especially up in an attic. Well, most of the time when we find mold up in an attic, it's because really the bathroom fan or the fan from the dryer or the fan from the range hood from the stove, they're either not present, not working, or not discharging into the atmosphere properly. That's probably 95+% of cases. There are cases where it's just hot up in the attic from a nearby forest or just where the house is built. There is maybe an aquifer underneath it that's causing moisture to be accumulating in the attic. Most of the time, we can identify it very easily and fix it very easily. Small areas of mold can be cleaned up. This is answering that question a little bit earlier, but hopefully this is helpful. If we get a call for somebody that has mold growth on one little area of their windowsill, we've probably talked out of several jobs, I mean, literally hundreds or more jobs over the years, because it's so simple to clean. It doesn't require a professional with licensing and a Tyvek suit in every case. Now, if we're talking a whole attic with mold, as I suggested, there should be a process for doing that. But if you have a little bit of mold around your windowsill, have a little bit of mold growth around your shower, a little bit of mold growth in a other odd area of your house, maybe in a corner where the gym clothes were, cleaning it's very easy. Hardware store antimicrobial products. Borax is actually a really good solution. It's definitely recommended over bleach. Bleach can work, but it's not recommended for the side effects and the water content, which aids in mold growth. Mold may be cleaned off of non-porous hard building materials. Porous materials may need to be discarded. If there is mold growth in especially books and clothes, it is hard to get that out. Dry cleaners will work for books or for clothes. In some cases, books. There are other items where dry cleaners are actually a viable option. We do a lot of that on the restoration side. But there are also cases where we simply say that material is just too damaged. You're not going to be able to get all the mold out. So that's a question of, do you want to live with that moldy couch or do you want to get rid of it? Semi-porous materials usually need to be treated with special chemicals to neutralize mold that have been grown underneath the surface. Mold is most often first identified by a home inspector in the attic or crawl space. And this is a good point for us. We do a lot of mold inspections. We do far less than we could. If somebody calls and says, hey, can you do a mold inspection? I have a client that's really concerned about mold, and we just want to be 100% sure. A lot of times we will ask, are you planning on having a home inspection done? And if the answer is yes, then we generally recommend having that home inspection done first. Why? Well, they're searching the entire house. As you know, they're documenting everything. They're probably going to find the mold. And quite frankly, they spend maybe even longer than we would for an average inspection. Now, there have been times where we have found mold that a home inspector has missed, but those are not overly common situations. It's pretty rare to find mold growing in large quantities in a living space of a house. Um, in those cases, there is generally a water mitigation issue that is present, plumbing leak, external foundation leak, gutter issue, roof issue. And so in those cases, if there is something, especially if you have somebody that's living there and they remove it and it comes back, that's probably a good time to call us because we can do more investigation to see what the moisture source is. Our process is to start with a spray of fungicide and to scrape the obvious mold growth. And after scrubbing, residual staining could remain but does not present any risk. This is probably these two steps are, or three steps, I should say, are probably where you're going to see the most variance in the industry. There are several companies out there that do things that are completely different to what we do. I'm not going to say they're all bad. There are companies out there that spray fogging into an area of mold and it removes it from visual appearances completely. We don't do that, and we haven't done that because we've found in a lot of cases mold grows back, but it doesn't treat the surfaces. It simply removes the mold to the extent that the fogging, the ozone treatment will affect those building materials. It does seem to work a large percentage of the time. I'd say probably more often than not. But we've dealt with it in enough cases where a mold has come back that we don't do that as part of our work. There are very rare cases we'll even talk about it if the areas are physically inaccessible. But in most cases, there's other better options that we can suggest. After scrubbing those areas, if there is any staining, again, we'd rather actually in some cases prefer that there's some staining there because that shows us that we've treated it because we will document the whole process of spraying those areas with fungicide. And then the final thing we do is apply a layer of encapsulant. We generally use a white paint. It's usually very obvious where we have treated and where we haven't. And the extremely rare situation where there's a small area that might be missed, it's going to be obvious because it won't be painted with white paint. And in most cases, we're not applying a thick layer of whiteness. It's just a layer to treat the mold that's present after the fungicide has already been done. So it's basically a double application of treatment technologies to prevent. Got a question here. Does lumberyard mold require treatment? No, it does not. We generally don't recommend it be treated. That being said, there are cases where you might have somebody that's moving in and they are immune compromised. We might recommend treatment as a preventative measure or a cautious measure for them. But as far as require, a lot of times we'll say, no, you don't need to treat that. And we can generally tell because the growth isn't consistent across those areas. If you have one board that's mold containing and then the next board touching it does not, it's probably lumberyard mold. Otherwise, why wouldn't you have growth throughout both of those areas? So good question on lumberyard mold. We don't typically recommend that that be treated. When we do our treatment, we generally recommend encapsulating not only the mold impacted areas, but the entire space. When we do that, we'll offer a warranty on our treatment projects. Other companies may not. That's just been our approach for the last 20 years. Again, fixing water intrusion sources, we do recommend this be done before we do our treatment measures. We often will do the repairs ourselves if it's a ventilation issue as part of our work concurrently. So that should be done within 24 to 48 hours before we do any sort of treatment. And generally, that's what we'll suggest. Fix the issue first, then call us or schedule those projects back to back. Um, we also recommend drying out the affected areas and consider waterproofing. This is especially an issue for living space or basements. Repairs may include major things like fixing roof leaks or installing roof vents or attic fans. We can do that as well. Repairs may include minor things like removing insulation or debris from soffit vents, reattaching bathroom fan exhaust lines to roof vents, etc. And it's worth noting that verification or clearance samples are sometimes requested to verify successful remediation. So it's a really tough one. If there is a request for sampling to be done afterwards, we are generally going to recommend that it be done several days after the treatment and after air scrubber is applied to those areas. So that the mold that was there previous to our work is removed so you have an accurate assessment. Question from Shelly here. I have a new listing with a lot of mold throughout. So I was a hoarder. Tubs, showers filled with mold like debris. Experience with cleaning showers and tubs on the surface. Usually that's pretty straightforward. Treating at the surface usually works just fine for addressing the mold. Basement shower surrounding, recommend. Mm. Yeah, in a case like that where you're talking about that much mold, that's probably where an inspection from maybe even one of our restoration technicians would be better because there could be some moisture issues there, but it's really hard. As you suggest, the seller, their lifestyle was conducive to mold growth. It's not crazy to think that everything should just be treated at the surfaces, cleaned off by us or by somebody, and then see what happens with the mold growth. Um, if there's a quick issue of funding, as you mentioned. Removing the base cabinets, I would start with cleaning the surfaces in a case like that, as I noted, before removing any cabinets. Um, if the sheetrock is going to be removed, that's going to make it really easy to see whether or not there is any mold there. A lot of this work, again, because there's not an industry standard, a lot of this work can definitely be done by a homeowner, by a general contractor. I'm not saying that that should be done, but that is a legal option. So I would recommend cleaning everything to the extent possible, removing any sheetrock that is very obviously saturated and damaged, and then seeing from there, or call us at that point. And maybe we can advise a little bit better after what could be done has been done, and we're not pointing out the obvious because there's obvious things in that situation. Okay, we're just about done here with the presentation. I'll hopefully leave a couple minutes for questions. Verification. Um, if there's ever a case where sampling is needed by an insurance agency or a person, we'll need to have that discussion beforehand. It is difficult to get that done. Yes, Gary, we'll make sure we get your slides here. I'm going to jump through this slide. Tape samples are sometimes done from remediated areas to show that it has been treated successfully. Air sampling is generally what's done, and as I mentioned, they should be done 7 days after prior to any testing because the air spores are present in the air. Guarantees, we offer a 5-year warranty. There's other companies that I've seen offer nothing to, I've seen lifetime warranties. I don't know how to say it other than to say it. I would proceed in those situations cautiously. Most of the companies that I've seen offer that are not in business anymore. Preventative measures, really general cleanliness, using fans, dehumidifiers, all really, really, really good ways to reduce mold growth in a property. You're getting ready to sell a house and you think there's a musky odor in the basement, get some dehumidifiers down there, get the windows open, get some good airflow going. That very well might address a lot of the issues of odor, and there might not be any mold actually down there. Conclusion, since mold is virtually everywhere, education and explanation of processes for inspections, testing, and remediation to clients is expected. So this is all to say, if you call us, we would really prefer to have a conversation because in most cases, every situation is not only different, but your clients are different. So every situation warrants that additional discussion to best advise what to do. What's your feeling about the accuracy of Swiffer dust testing? Dust testing is really hard. It's really hard. In talking to personally, from what I've seen and talking to our mold remediation manager, he doesn't find it to be very accurate. I have a hard time disagreeing with it. The science is just not really there yet to identify dust versus mold, one or the other, for what they're doing. And in part because mold grows on dust or has potential to grow on dust. So that's a hard one there. Scope of the remediation can differ depending on the circumstances, and different companies might have different approaches, often do. So agreeing upon work standards is highly recommended. This is a case where I don't want to say write alpha into your repair agreements, but certainly write your remediation expectations into your repair agreements if you're a buyer presenting that to a seller. Our approach is to provide a logical scientific approach to mold and presenting a solution that satisfies all parties. That's our endeavor. You might see in some cases where we don't meet your client's needs if they are saying you got to go above and beyond several times over, not only doing the SR 500, but more standards beyond that. We can do them. There have been cases where we have for real estate, but in a lot of cases, we're not abiding by those standards because of simple cost. If we make every single attic that has mold into it a moisture, water intrusion, restoration type project, like we would for insurance, the measures for containment are significantly higher, equipment use is higher, treatment process is more involved. It's going to take a 1-day project and turn it into at least 3 to 5 days. Obviously, the cost is going to go up. That's a big reason why we approach each situation so differently, and we like to have that conversation. If it's real estate, we don't generally recommend that type of a process. I have mostly pictures here, so if you guys have questions, feel free to submit them. I can answer them. I'm just going to play through some pictures here. Very obvious pictures of mold growth on those pieces of fruit and the ceiling. No question really needed. Question about colors of mold. White mold is a common one. You can see here there's different areas that were water impacted, and that is in part why it is a weird shape there in the attic. White mold's common. Sometimes we see fuzzy mold white that's like that. This is in a crawl space. Whitish gray mold, see some of that, very common in Oregon. Black mold, that's not the black crazy toxic mold, that doesn't exist. This is by far the most common mold that we see in Portland and the Pacific Northwest. Is a black mold that looks like this. It's not worse than any other mold necessarily. Question here, does alpha wipe down surfaces in a room or areas that have mold but no signs? Yes, if we find mold in a property as part of our scope, we will almost always recommend that. I don't know why we wouldn't. The only reason we wouldn't do it is if the client did not want to pay for it. More mold on studs here. Green and brown mold on drywall. Not mold. So here's some good slides. And again, this will be available for you in the PowerPoint slides that we'll give to you all. Paint blotches. You see here, there is no evidence of mold really anywhere. The white dots above are simply paint. In other areas where simply paint. Kind of looks like mold to the untrained eye, and maybe even to the trained eye, but when we look at it, we'll know pretty quickly, mostly because the 3D growth is different for paint versus mold. Leaching of minerals, we see this a lot, especially in basements, crawl spaces. It looks like mold, it has a growth pattern, but it's leaching from minerals. Water stains, this is really a tough one. It might require us going out there to look to verify. Fire damage, kind of looks like mold from a distance. So leachette white on the soil, it's common in crawl spaces as well, basements. Efflorescence orange on concrete wall, again, not mold. All right, so that's the end of our presentation. I know it's extremely packed presentation with information, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. Please call us if you have any questions. Appreciate the opportunity to present this class, and hopefully look forward to talking to you all in the future. Thank you very much.